I thought I would start with a very general presentation, really, about why we should be concerned about equity at all if we're interested in the MDGs specifically and in poverty reduction in general. Now the next thing is making it zap. Okay. Obviously, there's no necessary reason apart from gender equality, which is very much embedded in the MDG structure. More general, other dimensions of equality, of equity, are not embedded in the MDG structure in the same way. MDGs are essentially basic needs targets. So there's actually no necessary reason that you can see from the outside, from the way that the MDGs are structured, to worry about equity. But nonetheless, I think no, it's not working again. I think in the way that we think about the MDGs, though, there is an implicit equity focus. This is a hypothetical example. I've circulated this PowerPoint, and somebody said, "Oh, those are really interesting figures. What country did they come from?" And this is an entirely made up example to demonstrate a kind of mathematical point, really, that in this hypothetical example, where you start off 10 years before the MDGs with a certain proportion of the population undernourished in every income group, it is actually possible in this example to achieve the MDG on hunger, barely touching hunger among the poorest group in that country at all. This is an entirely made-up example in order to make the numbers work, but as both Richard and Patrick will tell you later from their own research, there are countries in which this is happening. Now, I think, although, abiding by the kind of letter of the law, that hypothetical country has met the MDGs, I think we would all instinctively feel that there was something wrong there, that that particular country hadn't quite met the spirit of the MDGs, at least. And if the MDGs are to sort of mean something, they have to be achieved with a certain amount of equity. There's just a kind of instinctive sense there about the way that we understand development and the kind of things that we're involved in trying to do. I think the question really for us and for those people who share that kind of reaction is, how do we translate that? How do we kind of examine that instinct, test whether it's actually right, and see how we can go about putting that into practice through the way that we analyse and kind of think about development, and then through what we do. I think another sort of reason why we should be worrying about equity, particularly in relation to the MDGs, now, and this is a moving beyond the kind of instinctive moral response and towards a more empirical sort of reasons why achieving the MDGs are going to be very difficult if we don't think about equity, is to do with kind of shifting trends in where poor people actually live. This is the work by Andy Sumner that Bella just mentioned, which is some new figures that Andy's just sort of published this week. I think they're available on the IDS website, around looking at, in fact, because a number of countries have, since the MDGs were, since the year 2000, a lot of countries have grown and have moved from being low-income countries to being middle-income countries. Poor people clearly have stayed where they are and have stayed poor, but many more of them now live in middle-income countries because economies have grown. So this graph shows you that the light-coloured bars are the percentage of the world's poor in middle-income countries in the top half of the graph, and low-income countries in the bottom half of the graph, where they lived in sort of data collected between 1988 and 1990. It shows you that at that point, the vast majority of poor people, this is below $1 a day poverty, so it's extremely poor people, lived in low-income countries. You can see that, according to the most recent figures in 2007-2008, that situation is now reversed, and the vast majority of poor people now live in middle-income countries. This is not because poor people have upped sticks and moved to China. It's because economies have grown around them, but poverty has persisted in those countries. And I think the point for me here, there's many interesting things to be said about this data, but the point I think for this particular purpose around equity is that where most poor people live in very extremely poor countries, one can argue that the problem of poverty is a function of the absolute lack of resources. And the point there is simply growth. Growth is the issue. Where poor people are living in middle-income countries, one can still argue in some of those countries that there is an absolute lack of resources, but increasingly, as poor people live in richer countries, the issue becomes distribution within those countries, and equity issues within those countries, as much as a kind of absolute lack of resources. So I think that's another reason to really focus on equity issues if we're interested in reducing poverty, because increasingly that's becoming the issue. Obviously this is a kind of question because of, I think, our sort of instinctive sense that equity is important. This has exercised people's minds for a long time. Why should we care about equity? And trying to sort of put a kind of empirical base on that, instinctive moral response. There's been a lot of research done on why we should care about equity and what equity can do for us, in a sense. In terms of the sort of different strategies that we might need to adopt to reach the MDGs in 2015, accelerate progress between now and then in order to do that, there are a number of sort of example reasons from the evidence collected in different countries around the world that focusing on the distribution of resources as well as the absolute level of resources might be a good thing and might be a kind of useful strategy for governments to adopt. Clearly, kind of mathematically, if you're a more equal country, then a given rate of growth is going to be more equally distributed and therefore increase poverty faster. There is some evidence, the evidence on this is kind of mixed, but there is some evidence that, certainly extremes of inequality are very bad for growth, and that moving to a more equal society, more equal economy can be good for growth. The World Bank themselves said this in 2006 in their report on equity and development, that you can imagine if you have a very unequal country, you have a large number of people who are simply excluded from the economy. So bringing those people in just adds a big sort of, a large number of people who can be productive and invest and so on. There's an argument also that is particularly pertinent around the financial crisis, that growth which is kind of more equitably distributed is more stable. If you have a kind of, a population which is where wealth is distributed more evenly and income is distributed more evenly, you have more sort of bigger domestic demand, you're less reliant on exports, and this can kind of be a buffer to big changes on global markets. Certainly this is the kind of strategy that China, for example, has adopted post-shock, was very much to try and focus on building the domestic market, and a focus on equity can be part of that. Better politics, obviously extremes of inequality are bad for politics, which is bad for growth. And I think there's some evidence, again, that Richard and Patrick are going to talk about in more detail, that a focus on equity and starting from a kind of point, looking at distribution and looking at who is poor and who is not, can improve aid spending. I mean, that's a sort of truism. Obviously, you need to know who's poor before you spend money on them. But looking in more detail, there's been a lot of work that's been done on this in relation to gender. That projects which have a sort of gender equity analysis embedded in them from the beginning can get better results. And if you don't do that, you can get some funny outcomes that you weren't expecting, just because you haven't actually looked at how people are likely to respond to the different incentives or the different kind of resources that you're offering. And I think for me, the combination of the kind of trend in where poor people live and, all of the different types of evidence around the sort of beneficial, the ways in which equity can contribute to growth suggests that if we don't start to focus on equity, that very quickly that will actually become a barrier to achieving the MDGs, that will in a sense have run up against the limits of what we can do without a focus on equity and without a better focus on distribution. And that might become a kind of barrier as we approach 2015 to actually managing to achieve those targets. I think another benefit for me of looking at this at equity from this rather more instrumental point of view, of kind of what can it do for poverty reduction rather than a goal in its own right, is that in policy terms it leads to a kind of focus on the win-wins. If you say there's equity here and then there's growth here, for example, that sort of immediately leads you towards looking at the two almost in opposition. And there's been a large amount of literature on whether there is or is not a trade-off between pursuing equity and pursuing other objectives. Now, there are some cases where they may exist, and you wouldn't necessarily want to pursue equity at all costs at the exclusion of all other objectives. But I think, in a sense, that's not really the question to ask. There are massive, there are a large number now of examples of where pursuing equity is good for growth in poverty reduction and vice versa. And the strongest evidence, possibly, although I'd be very open to being challenged on this, is around education. There's been a lot of work in Latin America and also in European countries around the sort of huge benefit that high quality primary and secondary education has in terms of closing the sort of skills gap, the skills differential, meaning that the kind of gap in wages between high-skilled and low-skilled workers can be closed by a sort of massive investment in education, in a sense, just raising skill levels. This has been very important in declining inequality in Latin America over the last 10 years. Clearly also, where you concentrate on your investment, if most poor people live in agriculture, then focusing investment on agriculture is going to be good for growth, as we all know, and also good for equity. And a focus on jobs. There's a hidden MDG that I sort of forgotten about until I started this round of looking at the MDGs. Under MDG 1, there is the focus, there is the income dollar a day target, which we all know about, there is the malnutrition target, and there is also, sandwiched in between those two, a target on full and decent work for all by 2015, so which somehow never gets talked about. And I think a focus on jobs is another really important kind of vehicle through it, and whether or not growth and kind of economic development is creating jobs is another really important dimension of making growth more equitable and ultimately, more stable. I think, though, I think there are very strong sort of instrumental, pragmatic arguments to be made about why we should care about equity if we care about the MDGs, and I think it's really important to know this and to sort of be able to make the case and, and to have a sort of very firm empirical foundation. But I think it's also, of course, important not to forget about the moral case. And I think perhaps the moral case is most compelling around intergenerational equality, which is why there's a picture of some cute children up on that screen. That, it seems particularly unfair for children to be, in a sense, suffering from inequalities that they were born into. This is just sort of perhaps where your kind of instinctive moral sense about inequality is strongest. And I think, while obviously, we want to focus on we want to be very rigorous and very academic and focus on the facts, I think we shouldn't deny our first feeling and our very strong moral case, and that, that ultimately is really important and is one of the kind of driving forces behind the MDGs and these kind of international projects on poverty. It's my last slide.
Okay, good.
So I think the kind of so what? So we can agree that equity is important from a moral point of view and from a kind of empirical poverty reducing point of view. So what? For me, the agenda is a sort of combination of a sort of research agenda and a political agenda, is to find out which inequalities really matter. We talk about equity, but clearly a government can't pursue equity. They can pursue equity in income or in landholding or in access to health services. And I think, from sort of making a policy agenda out of this, for me the first thing is to understand if we're interested in equity from the point of view of promoting growth, promoting poverty reduction, which is the equity which is actually the most important. I think linked to that, that's partly a kind of, there are many different ways to research that question. One of those is to look at success. There have been a lot of, there have actually been, particularly in Latin America, as I said, examples over the last 10 years of countries quite successfully reducing inequality, and how have they done it, and what are the dimensions of inequality that have proved most effective and also most politically possible. Clearly it's a tricky political act to pull off. And then a political question. How could you actually make this happen? It's traditionally been the kind of untouchable, the most difficult, the most kind of challenging of all political projects is to try and make things, you know, more equitable, and it's where you really start to run up against deeply entrenched interests. So what is the politics here, and how could you actually make it work in practice? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take some questions from panel now because
Yeah,
time's running
sure.
out. Okay.